Hello.
All right, so we're recording. Awesome. We're good to go then. Welcome, Shah. It's all
Oh,
yours.
hey. All right. Thanks for this. Cool. Let me go ahead and share my screen. I'll also have the discuss panel open. If you have questions along the way, hit me up. Cool. There we go. See this okay? All right. Cool. So we'll get started. Hey everyone. My name is Shah Rahman. I am a senior product manager over at Blizzard Entertainment. I'm currently working in the online community health space within BattleNet and online products. And what I do right now is mainly focus on making sure all of our social engagements in our online spaces are safe and healthy. So, working with a lot of different kinds of player generated content and making sure that it's clean. And so, what I'm going to talk about today is design driven product development. Unfortunately, I can't share much of my work that I do day to day because a lot of my products are internal and focus on helping the game teams safeguard that content. So I hope all the assets inside the wonderful stock images, I hope you enjoyed as much as I enjoyed looking for it. So go ahead and get started. We have the design thinking loop, right? And this is what I call it. I call it the loop because you have normal design thinking, which is empathy focused around the user. But I call it the loop because you have to constantly iterate through it. You constantly have to go through this process of thinking about the user, empathizing, identifying the problem, creating potential solutions, and going through that loop over and over again as you build different learning mechanisms. So this talk effectively goes into applying design thinking into product management. And the goal is to kind of share along the way the different processes that I found over the years and that I've used for you. Take what makes sense for your product. Make sure you look at your capabilities on your team, and then understand from there what you can and can't do. Right. So really make this yours and personalize it. So we'll get started. The first part of design thinking, as well as I think product management, should be empathizing with the user, but not just the user. You also want to look for the people around them. So, what I like to do personally, I'm in an internal product right now. I love to have one-on-one user interviews. If your users are available to you, it's wonderful to reach out, get that one-on-one time, because you're not only just going to get that personalized space to speak to them, ask them questions, but you're also going to get visibility into their specific scenario, what they're dealing with, what gets them to use your product or not use your product, and what different problems that they're dealing with. And if you have a larger group of people that you're working with, and you already have your groups and your cohorts spread out, you maybe user personas, then you can use user group surveys. This is a great space if you need to ask specific questions, get an understanding of rating. I use this one specifically for my product when I want to understand what people's overall satisfaction scores are for specific parts of the product, or whether they need access to specific bits or whether they're interested in specific parts of the product. So surveys are great for that. You also have focus groups around specific problem spaces. So if I want to dig into one specific portion of the problem, one specific portion of the product, focus groups are wonderful for that space. Leverage the expertise around you in your designers and your user researchers, and run some focus groups. Take that learning, to better understand how you can empathize maybe with that specific group if they're having an especially difficult time. And then my excuse me, my favorite one, if we can pull it off, right, is direct observation. So if you have direct observation of people using your product and tool, then you really get an idea of what they're doing, what they're thinking. We've done this before with eye tracking software as well, right? Letting the people know, hey, we're gonna keep an eye on where you're looking on the screen, how you're interacting with different parts of the UI. Another great part here is you really get to peek into the user's mind while they're using your product, as opposed to in the one-on-one user interviews. You're mainly asking questions and having that conversation. So I'd say, when you're starting out, the one-on-one user interviews, if you don't have a product yet, or product increment or prototype to share yet, that's a great way to start. And then the latter one, when you do have a prototype to share, the direct observation is awesome, and we'll come back to that in a little bit as well. And as I noted before, if you have questions along the way, throw them in the discuss. and we'll stop along the way, take a look. We'll also stop at the end and have a QA session. So the next part, after you've empathized with the user, you want to try to start to understand and define what their situation is. Within their situation, what the problem is that they're dealing with that gets them to use your product as a solution. What impacts that space, and how volatile is it? How volatile it is, right? Like how likely is it to change? So we're starting with the situation here. You don't want to just say, what is the user doing when they're in my product? You want to think about what is the user experiencing well before they even get to that need recognition of jumping into my product. That helps you understand why your product is valuable to them and why it's necessary, as well as like other vectors that you could approach the solution. You can also jump into what impacts a problem. So a user may come to use your product, and that may be one of 4 or 5 reasons, right? When you understand what impacts that problem and other products that they use, other solutions that they have to go use in combination with what you're giving them, that's when you start understanding a bit more on once you get your product out the door, what are the different KPIs that really start to matter, right? And what can you use to drive iteration and innovation after that? The next one is what variables exist in the environment. So, whereas the last one was what are the impactors of the problem space itself, this one is variables. Someone may be using your product in order to solve someone else's problem. They may be working within a group where they have a key role. They may be working within an organization where, as a part of their role, a small part is using your product. At that point, you really need to expand your user base and your studying, your research to all of those people and all those variables involved because they determine if and when and how your product gets used. We'll talk about this a little bit more in terms of, down the line, different methods to identify these groups. And then the last one, this one really keeps going. How likely are things to change? It is a loop, right? You really need to come back to this over and over again. What I mean by that is you need to keep it top of mind for you as the product manager, as your designers as well, your engineers, always keep in top of mind what is changing, what are things that are likely to change, and how does that impact what you're working on. It's much cheaper to make a change earlier in development based on things have changed versus when you're getting close to getting out the door or getting released and trying to make incremental updates live as well as being potentially a dependency to other products. So this is a loop that you should always be churning through in your head. I'm gonna take a quick sip of coffee. It's early here in the US. All right, so you've empathized with your users. You've defined the scenario they're in, the problem they're dealing with, how likely things are to change. Now you want to ideate on potential solutions that you want to provide to them and further ways that you can even define the problem as you come through ideation. So again, like I said, it was a loop, go back and forth in through this process. And as you ideate, if you realize that there's other problems to solve or bigger problems to solve, go do that. It's a better time to do it now than later down the road. So as I jump in, I try to understand where my area of control is and where I need help when it comes to product management. The first part is what's the most painful problem or part of the problem that you can solve for the user today? That's what's going to help you prioritize down the road, as well as understand, what area kind of matches that perfect space of you have control, as well as it's a painful issue for the user and you want to solve that. Something that's an extra level of complication here on my side specifically is because I have an internal product that game developers use to integrate into their games and applications, my end user is still the player, right? So I have to think about what is the most painful part of the problem that the players are dealing with. And then through my technology and my product itself, what is the most painful part of the problem that the game developers are dealing with? So there's multiple layers to these as well that you can assign. And like I said, it's not just about that very end level user and their problem. Look at the broader scenario of what's going on and try to identify what everyone's problem is and then go in and pick the parts that you can control. So number 2 digs into that. What part of the impactors do you have control over the most? And then number 3 here says, what variables do you have zero control over that you need help from other organizations or even other products? So as you're talking to users, you can kind of get an understanding of what you do have control over, what you can improve for them. And then the next one on the zero control, When you identify that they are having problems that you cannot solve, it's great to just clearly ask, what other things are you using? What other tools are you using? What resources do you additionally have to solve the rest of your problem that you're dealing with in this space? And then when you understand that, you can identify whether that becomes part of the normal tool set that users interact with as they use your product, or if that's something you want to explore yourself and expanding your product to cover that use case of. And then I always keep this in there, how likely are things to change? Just like we talked about in definition, when it comes to ideation, think about how likely things are to change. As you dig into other methods of scoping, prioritization, project management, as a part of the product management scope in a lot of spaces, you really want to think about trade-offs and places that you want to go next with your product after this initial iteration is done. One of the places I like to look at for this is IDEO's design kit. It's an awesome design kit, has a lot of different methods that you could use. This is definitely not a sponsored talk, obviously, but I just personally use this a lot to find out various different ways that you could run these exercises. And my team responded really well to it as well. I shared it with them, and they picked a few that they wanted to try. So give it a try if you don't already have a few processes for things like definition, ideation, and so on. So now you got to put your product management hat on because people are starting to ask, cool, what are you solving? When is it coming out? When do we get it? Lewis C. Lin has, what's called the circles method that a lot of groups use. I know a lot of product managers will be familiar with this. Um, it really helps you kind of take all the information you did up front on the design research and then apply it to product management, project management. It helps you solidify it for a team to understand what you're working on and why. It helps you create a development plan that you can share with, let's say, internal integration teams and even users to give them visibility into what's coming. So let's dig into this process. The circles method starts with comprehending the situation. We did that up front, right? With the design thinking, we empathized, we looked at the situation and the scenario that the user is in, what they're dealing with, who's involved, why they're in that situation, and how they plan to go about solving their problems. And then we talked about the different kind of customers that could exist. This method offers a nice way to kind of create those user groups that are called personas. And like I said before, your personas aren't just your users. Your personas can be your users, the people that they interact with, the people that influence them, to use your product or not use their product, and people that they look to for help and people that they look to for other product suggestions as well. These can all be personas that you create, you reach out to, you speak to, and you engage with because they all have use cases and needs that will impact your product. So don't limit yourself here on personas to only the people that use your product directly. In my space, for example, when I think about my internal product and offering platform services and tooling to game teams and application owners across Blizzard, I think about not only those engineers that are integrating the system as a persona, but also the producers and product manager and business managers in those groups. I think about the different types of players that are in our different type of games and have personas for them, and think about how they all interact with this ecosystem together and all their needs. So you may not translate all of those needs into what your product solves, but it's good to understand what those needs are and how they work with each other. The next one is cutting through prioritization and return on investment. This is a big part of it, especially if you're on a leaner team. I love starting with small groups when solving these types of problems because you can get through these processes quickly, but you can also offer a really strong return on investment if you have a small group developing these solutions, getting it out the door, and then scaling up the team. So from the product management perspective, this helps you kind of understand how you're prioritizing the work itself, but also maybe the support that you need to get that work out the door, and then what you need to scale it. So it's really good to spend some time in this space. The next part is solutions. So we talked about ideation right before this space, right? So taking those, you want to list out solutions, multiple solutions, and you want to pick the best one that you want to go off based off the trade-offs that you've looked into. You want to be objective about it and understand what the best value is. So as we talked about before, where do you have the most control in terms of solving the user's problem? and where is the most painful problem to the user. Matching those two bits up and understanding what the greatest value is to the user often turns into the greatest value for the organization. But if it's not, if there's a mismatch, this is a good method to look at it and try to understand what gives you the best bang for the buck for both your organization, your company, as well as the users. The next one, we'll jump into kind of summarizing the recommendation. So after you've had all this, it's good to document it, keep it in place, because once you speak to, let's say, investors, internal stakeholders, or even your users, if you're sharing this level of data with them, it's really good to show your work. It's good to show your thought process and your mindset and your cultural values and how they come about when you're making decisions like this. So I like to have that summarized recommendation, but I also like to have this documentation in place so you can share it at any time. Because transparency is on the other half of this development cycle. When you're sharing your communication, super important to be transparent and honest. So share your work and keep that in there. But for that summarized recommendation, I like to keep it clean. It doesn't list it here up front, but the why is what I start with. Right? Why are we solving this problem? Why does my product exist? Why does my team exist? And what are we doing to solve this specific problem? Why are we solving this problem versus all of our other ones that we could solve today? Who our users are, as well as when you can actually expect to get the thing in your hands, right? When are we expecting to release an iteration, whether it's an internal alpha or a user facing beta or launch, right? Give people that visibility. So, what you should really come out of this process with is a nice looking development plan that has a summary for those that just want that quick snapshot, but also detailed information for people that want to dig into parts of it, like your personas to understand who your users are, or your list of solutions to see, maybe the organization wants to spin up another team to help in this space as well. You can hand off some of those other solutions and get some partners running. Cool. So now that you have that, you have your team together, you have your designers kind of running full steam, taking all of that wonderful research data that you have, maybe even conducting some more interviews with broader personas that you've identified. It's time to start designing and prototyping. Now, this is where everybody should be involved. Just like the circles method, your entire team should be involved in this. It should not just be you as a product manager. It should not just be a group of product managers. It's good to get everybody involved into these phases of development because they get engaged into the problem space. They start to understand and empathize more deeply with the user. And as you get through development, you don't want to be the only expert about this, right? You want everybody to have, important, meaningful conversations about the trade-offs and about what you're doing. So it's really good to bring everyone along for the ride. And that especially starts to show itself when you get into prototyping. And before you share it outward, share it within your team. Run some prototype tests on your team. Um, Kind of run them with different groups internally, and then start widening out and running more interviews with your users. So when it comes to prototyping, something I want to call out, everybody has their own limitations and capabilities in this space. Depending on what kind of tool or product you're working with, you may have to be doing, like what you see in this picture, some paper prototyping. You may have, high fidelity mockups and high fidelity prototype experiences or demos that you run through. And then my favorite, you may have really high interaction, user interaction heavy prototypes that you could run through so you could really see what that experience is like. The good thing about this last one of interaction based prototype is there's a lot of tools out there, a lot of them free as well. But we use Figma and I've used Axure for this as well. It's really easy to get a prototype going and it's cheap. So you don't have to go try to create, QA server, get all your information and your data up and running and get an interactive prototype there. You can learn well before that you're in that deep building phase where it becomes more expensive to change things by creating prototypes now. So when it comes to prototypes, something I want to call out is don't just prototype the tool. And you could fall into the trap of only prototyping the tool itself. So you start your prototype interview and you tell the user, okay, you're in my tool, go. And the user now has to create this fake scenario in their mind of, okay, why would I use the tool? What am I dealing with in my, personal life that's caused me to come use this? What am I dealing with professionally? Who asked me to do something in some cases if they use your tool for a specific part of their job and not all of their job? So something I like to do here is create that user scenario. So as you jump into these interviews, make sure that you're creating a scenario that says, okay, here's here's what you're dealing with. I'll give you some examples. And now you're jumping in and using our product. Use the product, go through that prototype, and then on the other side of that, leave space for feedback and ask them for what they're feeling, what they're thinking, what they're doing along the way. Remember, this is the interactive, observational interview as opposed to the first one where you're trying to gather information around the problem and what the user's dealing with. Now that you have a decent idea of that and you're running through these prototypes, you'll see how that's applied. Now, the good part here is going back, to first second slide, is this is a part of that loop again. You're going to learn things from the user that you didn't before when you were just having that conversational back and forth about what's going on. So this is another really great time to iterate and make changes. Okay. If you find a change now that you need to make and you wait till after release, that is a much more expensive time where that change may not even be relevant anymore. And on the opposite end of that, it may be so painful that the user doesn't use your product and looks for alternatives because you haven't solved the problem. Okay, so it's really important to be thoughtful here and deliberate and iterate in this space while you're in a prototype mode. And then finally, when data is missing, go for your gut, right? Use your intuition, your design intuition, your product intuition, your team's engineering intuition, right? Take the expertise that you have on your team. And if you don't know the answer and you don't know the specific way you need to go with an interaction or a design decision, use your experience, make the decision, and build in measurement mechanisms so you can pull data on the outcome and see if you actually met what you needed to. Cool. So you have the implementation section next, and with implementation, I'm not going to really talk about all the different development methodologies out there. That's not what this talk about. But because we're talking about design-driven product management and product development, I'll talk about what's important while your team is doing the implementation. You want to make sure that you're building in measurements. Okay, building in the measurements and learning mechanisms now, as we talked about as a part of that prototype, is super important because you're setting out for iteration. Most services are no longer, boxed products that you just get out the door. We're in the internet now, right? So anything you take out the door it's effectively, once you release, it's a service if you plan to continue developing it. So you need data to tell you how things are going for your product, for your service, things like uptime or how your product is doing, as well as how customers are using your product. So as you build, you want to set up these measurement systems, and then you want to dig into ways to kind of automate getting that data into a space that's visible. So for this, I like to look at dashboards. And there's three types of dashboards that I'll talk about today. We have the product dashboard, fairly simple, straightforward. How's my product doing, right? How are the users interacting with the product? What are problems that they may be having in that space based on errors that I've set up? And where are different metrics that I'm collecting around the product so I can understand what key performance indicators are, right? Your KPIs that really drive your business and learning what drives those KPIs, right? That's kind of your product dashboard. Your service health, excuse me, your service health can be something that you set up dashboards for internally and externally. Internally, it could be things like, how's my API, right? When users come in and they want to check against an API, they want to see if it's up, if it's available, if there are, thresholds that are being hit, if there's downtimes coming up, things like that. It's really good to have dashboards to explain and give this visibility into a centralized space for your internal users so they can always treat it as a source of truth. Another great usage of service health dashboards is external, giving your users clarity into whether your service is up. For example, I love Slacks as an example here. Their kind of service availability dashboard is pretty awesome. It offers a clear table. It gives you a nice key to tell you how to read that table, and it tells you what different products, parts of the product, and services of the product are up and available or not. And it's good that they separated away from Slack, obviously. So if Slack goes down, you can still get an understanding of what's going on that page. So then you have your customer health dashboards. Now, this is something that you can set up internally, and it really depends on your product in this case. So I'll speak to mine specifically. because I offer a platform service that different game teams and application owners use and leverage, we want to make sure that they're on, let's say, the latest package, the latest version of what we're releasing. We want to make sure that they have the latest data that they need. These are things, if you're working with internal systems, that you should absolutely leverage. If you have access to that data in terms of how users are leveraging your product, you absolutely should take advantage of that. Set up a dashboard, use it for your own visibility, but also let the users keep an eye on it to make sure that they're staying up with the latest and greatest as well. I'm going to take a look at discuss real quick, see if there's any burning questions in here before we move too far forward. I have a question on which tool to solve some specific user problems. Cool. So keep kind of looking at those questions. If you have more questions, throw them in there. If it's towards a specific slide, feel free to note what slide your question is about, and we can always come back to it during Q&A. So we'll keep going here. All right, communication. So communicating with kind of your users, your stakeholders, your team as well is critically important here. I say your team because even though you may think that your team is constantly kind of informed of what you're doing, why you're doing it, when things are happening, that can quickly get away from everybody when they're in the midst of development, right? So it's great to remind everyone kind of what's going on, what are our values, what are our goals. One thing I like to do in this space is chartering a team at the beginning of developing a product. And what that charter allows you to do is establish kind of an aspirational vision for the team. Kind of, what kind of world are you trying to create? And it can be product centric or it can be the purpose of the team. Kind of an operational mission of how you're achieving that. And then you want to timeline that, like, your operational mission can be for this year. Then you want to think about your values and your goals. And you take that and you can use that as a part of your communications internally so the rest of the organization knows what you're up to and what you're all about, but also keep it as a part of the team so you can keep them focused on your values and drive your decision making framework from those values as well. And it acts as a nice supplemental piece to the user values that you've extracted at the beginning of this process when you've done your interviews. Now, when you want to communicate, though, you definitely want to make sure it's powerful. And so a lot of you might be wondering kind of what is this, blue orange that we're looking at here? Powerful imagery, easy readability, easy understandable, like messaging as well as readable messaging. It really depends on how you're communicating, whether you're sending out videos, newsletters. I like newsletters personally because they feel personal and I can kind of speak to different crowds based on where the newsletter is going. You want to make sure that you're standing out. If you're internal and you see that, a lot of product updates are maybe emails, level that up a bit. Turn that into an email that's got a newsletter, that's got a theme, some branding to it, so people know when it's from you. When you're reaching out to users, you're dealing with all the brands, you're dealing with all the marketing experts out there that know how to reach users. This is where you have a chance to differentiate yourself. If you have a product where you see everybody's updates are emails, go make a video. Create a streaming service kind of presence for yourself and start communicating what you're about. So let's get into specifically what you're communicating here. When you're first starting out, you can look at that charter and really communicate what your team is about. And in this case, at your scale, it may be your entire company. And you want to communicate that and set that standard up front to say it's not just about what we're building, it's about why we're here and communicate what that's about. And then continue that when you're sending out further communications as well. So even if you're sending out a communication about, hey, here's our goals, here's our progress towards goals, whether it be development goals or product goals, and here's how we're doing, always start at the beginning with why you exist, why the team is there, why the product is there, why you're solving the specific problems that you are. And what that helps you do is it helps you engage the new people that may be reading, listening, or watching your communication. And it also helps re-engage people that may have kind of fallen off because you're likely not going to be communicating with people on a consistent basis, whether internally or your users, as you're developing a new product or even an iteration because you want to focus that time on development itself. So when you come back, remind people, take that time to remind them what you're about, why you're there. Now, within that communication, goals are what I like to focus on. Now, whether you're using objectives and key results in the OKR system or SMART goals whatever you want to call them, whatever system you're using. The important piece here is to share them and be honest about them. Now, we've talked enough about sharing it, but be honest in this space, right? Obviously, there's private bits of goals and organizational goals or product goals that you may not be able to share because it's internal data, but share the user related goals and your results that you're trying to measure outward and be transparent about it. Notify the users and stakeholders as well when things change. That way they know where you're coming from. They've seen your charter, they know what you're about. They've seen your product, they know what you're trying to solve. They look at your goals and they see, cool, this is how they're trying to solve them. This is how they're trying to measure, the definition of done, whether they've actually achieved it. And when they see things change, there's less people asking why. And that's because they kind of understand what you're about now. They understand more than just what you're trying to build. They understand what your goals are. And so when things change, give them that why and really be clear, transparent, and honest about it. It's going to build your character internally and it's going to build your reputation and trust externally as well. And then be consistent, right? Offer that visibility on a consistent basis. Did you have a Q1 introduction to your team with maybe your chartering and what problem you're solving? Q2, you shared some of your goals for the year. Q3, come in and share that progress. Even if you're blocked on one of those goals, share that progress and let them know what's happening because you want to give them that heads up versus saying in Q3 or Q4, hey, I'm sorry we weren't able to meet one of our goals. Because then the question does become why. But if you explain along the way, there's a lot less work for you to do and it's easier for you to just continue telling that story. And finally, you do want to celebrate. You want to celebrate with your users, you want to celebrate with your stakeholders, your team, absolutely. Whether it's a win or a loss, because those losses you could turn into learning opportunities and you can celebrate those learning opportunities as well. And that's important because the more you do this, the more you'll feel deeply engaged and involved in solving that problem space. And when your users get excited, if your team gets excited, that energy carries into your development. Cool. So this is another piece, if you're communicating pretty much at all phases of this process, measuring and learning is something you also want to do. Now, you started measuring and learning really at the beginning when you started talking to your users and digging into the problem space and defining it and ideating. You started thinking about, okay, well, what do we have to measure in order to say that we're done? What do we have to measure in order to say that the problem is being solved or we're starting to learn more about pieces that we don't know about, like we talked about in the prototype section? So what you want to do here is you want to share the learnings based on what you're measuring, just like you shared the communications for your goals. So your product's out the door, you have your dashboard set up. You want to look at that consistently, but don't make the mistake of only looking at your dashboards for wins. Okay? Look at your dashboards for question marks, for things that you really don't know the reasoning behind. Like why is that data moving in that direction? Find your drivers. So on a dashboard, the way I look at it is you have your metrics, right? Everything that you're collecting data from. Then you have your key performance indicators that are driving either the business results of your product or the user kind of value points of your product. If you just say that we have a really strong business result or a really strong KPI that's user related and you don't know what's driving it, then you're not really taking away as much as you could. Let's say you have a really strong KPI around the users in terms of how often they're using your product. Ask yourself why. Why are they using that product that much? Dig into other parts of your dashboards where you've dug into or where you've separated out kind of what aspects of the product are they using, what different services are they using, how they're using it. Find out those drivers because that will help you understand what you may need to expand on or iterate on or do further interviews on to figure out, hey, is this the real problem? Is this the deeper problem? And then what you can do in that iteration is you can actually simplify your product in some cases because it may be doing too much. And that simplification is a breath of fresh air for the user because it kind of makes their job easier. It makes their world easier as well when they're interacting with your product. It's not always about looking at the data and finding ways to add things to your product. All right, so you want to integrate the learnings into the communications we talked about, and then you want to grab user feedback and validation. So let's say you saw some data and you said, you know what, based on what we've seen after 2 quarters of usage, we want to make a pretty drastic change to the product. Don't just be a slave to those numbers. You need to validate again against your users because the data is giving you an objective view of what the users are doing. It's not telling you what they're thinking. It's not telling you what they're dealing with in their external environment. It's not giving you more data sometimes on those variables we talked about earlier that impact the need recognition to use your product. It's not telling you about everyone else involved in that process that your product exists within that doesn't directly use it. So always validate those changes, right? That means you may need to go back to your prototype, update it to what's on the live version today, make that change that you're kind of wanting to make, run that against users again, right? And make sure that that's actually what they need in that space. And then finally, taking all this information, you want to either define the next problem that you're going to dig into, or I like this one more. You want to redefine your existing one. So you may learn after all of this work and getting it out the door that the problem you were trying to focus on is not the best one. It's completely surface level, and there were things that were much deeper that would provide a lot more value. That's good. You've actually gone through a really great process along with the user to come to that realization. And when you share that with them, it's going to show that you're engaged, knowledgeable, and an expert in that space. And they're going to trust you to solve that problem that's deeper now. Cool. So super long process, right? I think the last 2 or 3 times I've used this, it's taken roughly a year. But like I said, getting through the communication, setting that up, getting that first iteration out, you really do want to make sure you scope your product down so you can get it out and start learning from the data and talking to your users more and more. That's obviously not going to work with everyone's product based on what scale it is and what you're trying to support. But what this process does is it lets you take pieces in and out that are important, that make sense, and are relevant to what you're trying to do. And it allows you to kind of work with your users along the way. So, in quick review, this is taking a design driven product development approach, whereas there are other ways to do this. There's technology driven approaches, there's data driven approaches. This one kind of empathizes with the user and goes from there. So, if we look at the process itself, you're focusing on the user and the problem you're solving for them, and everything else you're doing kind of goes around that. You're starting with empathizing with what the user is dealing with. You're defining the broader situation that the user is in, the problem or problems that they're dealing with, what impacts them, and how likely things are to change, right? That volatility. You're ideating on potential solutions that and further ways to solve the problem that you can either come back to later or share with more teams and get them along for the ride. You're applying a user-driven prioritization and scoping method. In this case, I use circles, but there's so many other, cool ways to do this. So I actually like to change things up and try something different each time I get to this phase here because there's just a lot of value in trying all these different methods out. You want to design and prototype potential solutions and then run those through another round of user interviews, sometimes stakeholder interviews and team interviews as well. And then you want to build measurements and learning mechanisms to set up for iteration. So as you build, you want to think about what you're measuring, what your drivers could be, what your key performance indicators are for success in terms of business as well as user value. And then you want to communicate all of that. You want to communicate that in the form of goals and your progress towards those goals, whether they're business goals, organizational goals as a part of a broader company, as well as product goals. And you want to communicate that to stakeholders, users, and your team. So everyone's kind of in line and aligned on what you're doing. You want to always measure your results and communicate your learnings and changes. This brings everyone along for the ride, keeps everyone engaged into what you're doing. There's no reason to internalize that, and there's no reason to share that data late. Share it consistently, share it thoroughly, and be transparent, and you'll have a lot more trust when it comes to making change and managing that change. And then finally, you want to take this process in a loop and define that problem again, and then kind of start back at number one, whether it's the next iteration of your product, a new product altogether, or just taking the same problem space and expanding on it. Cool. So we'll look to see if there's any questions. And Tejas, if you've collected some questions as well, feel free to let me know.
Yeah, sure. There was one question when you were talking about the dashboards and like visualizing information. They wanted to know, like when you were speaking of customer health dashboards, what those were.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Cool. So I can dig into that. So customer health dashboards are something that you can definitely create for an internal product. The example I gave is, I have a platform. My product exists as a part of a platform. That means we have internal users that are also consuming that platform. And in doing so, there's various pieces of technology that are floating around in that space. And everybody has, kind of autonomy to either update to certain versions or further augment when they've consumed a service, at a client level once they've consumed it. It's good to have that data in a dashboard type space so you can understand where your users are at. So with internal products, because you have access to more data than you would externally, it's good to leverage that data. And the specific example I called out is versioning. For example, if you're getting your product out and you give people time to update to the latest version, an example of an internal customer health dashboard is showing what version all of your consumers are at. And what this helps you do is understand if somebody's having a problem, it may be because they're a version behind, and that saves you that step of investigation. It also lets you proactively approach that customer or those customer groups and say, hey, let's get you updated to the latest version or figure out different ways to handle whatever work you need to do to get up to the latest version because you may be blocked, right? But that's just one of the many metrics that you could throw in there. Other one could be kind of how often the customers fail, right? Like how often does your product specifically fail for specific customers? And having that dashboard set up internally helps a lot. It gives you that help of one customer versus the other. So in the case of having a platform service, because I have multiple game teams using that product, it would be really good to know if a specific customer is failing. And sometimes that's difficult to get. So having that set up as a dashboard gives you that proactive visibility.
Awesome, thanks. I actually had one of my own. Mostly, like a lot of teams I've worked with, right? Some of the specific again related to dashboards, visualization really helps a lot. Even simple things like you're running sprints, doing agile, right?
Yeah.
Like having your burn down and whatnot. Those things are amazing. But a lot of the good teams, like they have their own custom dashboards, custom visualization for radius systems and whatnot. At what scale or like what do you think is a good team size or business size where it becomes a must to have somebody building that? Because I've seen a lot of small studios here, they could definitely benefit from custom visualizations, but they just not big enough to hire somebody to start
Yeah.
doing that. Do you have any opinions on like when's a good time where okay now you're big enough you should definitely start looking at having somebody build these?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you can kind of apply this process to it to figure that out as well, right? So if you think about, what is the reasoning for having these dashboards in the first place? Is it that the team needs that visibility, or does the organization need it? Do release managers, for example, need it to have cross visibility across many teams, right? Is that the impetus of it? And that can kind of help you decide that level of investment that you're going to put in. If it's just your team, then I would look at tools that already exist today. So, for example, if you're using agile development and you're in a space like Jira, they have a lot of reporting that's there in the first place, but you can also extract that data to put it into other spaces. You could use, Google Data Studio. You could use um, Tableau and other things like that if you have a lot of data that you're working with. But I'd keep it simple and keep it relevant. So if you're looking at agile dashboards, for example, for your development metrics, use the tool that you're using to do the product management, or I'm sorry, the project management software, because that often has the reporting that you need. But let's say you are doing kind of what I'm working on and you're getting a platform service out the door and you want to look at kind of what kind of dashboarding to set up. So there's multiple ways you could go about that. You could use existing kind of enterprise software, let's say New Relic, to set up dashboards on your product's health, right? And that's a service that you could buy rather than build yourself because often that becomes cheaper, especially when it comes to like supporting the entire enterprise with it. And then the other part, you could look at what other teams are using as data sources and data systems to visualize. So, a lot of our teams use Tableau internally. So that may be a space where I put a lot of our customer health dashboards, is that Tableau space. So it really depends on kind of what your team's needs are, what the impetus is behind creating those dashboards in the first place in order to decide kind of how you want to solve that.
So I just had to unmute myself. This is an interesting question. Although I think like what you talked about is pretty much still applicable or for game development, but Srinath is asking, not to sound lazy, but since this is a very comprehensive methodology, there's a lot going on there. Are there any notable places where the process could be short-circuited in the specific domains of game development? Maybe in identifying user issues or validating whether a change was for the better.
Yeah,
Uh, like, what do you think?
yeah, absolutely. I think in the space of game development, what's really interesting here is, as let's say you've gotten out the door, you have your game out the door, and you're looking for data to come back on a new feature. One way you could apply this is, let's say you have millions of players playing your game. You may not be able to actually reach out to each one and have that conversation, but you're running surveys. One thing you could do is short circuit, like you said, this entire process and take the data from the survey that you need in order to inform what problem you're solving next. And that can help you look at either the features you're working on today or the features that you just released and understand whether you're hitting your goals. So obviously when you're doing, let's say, feature development for a game, you're identifying metrics that you want to collect and KPIs that drive your business, right? So take that data and take surveys to combine it and understand whether you're meeting your goals. And then you can use that as your iterative loop here, right? You may not have the time to do prototyping, may not have the time to do your ideation. You may already have a group of designers that have, pretty well laid out what a product is going to do. And you need to just bring it down to I'm taking the survey results and I'm taking the dashboards that we have in place to understand whether we're solving the problem. That's a yes or no. If it's a no, go back to that ideation phase. If it's a yes, take the data and understand what you want to develop next or what part of that pre-existing design you may want to implement next. But I think if you really want like the perfect short circuit here, something like the circles method, having that as like a template for yourself allows you to kind of plug in all the data that you have and just go into specific pieces. So let's say you've done that for your game and you have kind of that document of all those phases of the circles method that I talked about, and a new set of users come in. All you may have to do is just go update your personas and your use cases. And then everything else is already kind of there for you to use. So you can kind of keep that going and just augment that data over time and use that to think about what goes next. But there isn't really a great like short circuit altogether that would make this quick because this is going to be a time consuming process because you're trying to get data from your users and you're trying to think deliberately about it on how to solve a problem and whether the problem you're solving is even correct or not. And then you're going and building, learning mechanisms as you implement and taking that to iterate. So it is a long process.
So we've got one more. So Pawan Kumar is asking, what type of problem solving can or should be considered while designing a game? So I guess more in terms of features or your audience.
Yeah,
Yeah.
there's so many. When considering designing a game, I think the last few times, so I've been at Zynga, Riot Games as well, working on some of those games, and at Blizzard I was on Overwatch for a little bit. And when I think about that specifically problem solving, when considering designing a game, I think about the core game loop, right? What is the player doing in the game? What is the main thing that they're coming into the game and doing, and then leaving after they're done? What is that feeling at the end of each core game loop that you're trying to create? Are you trying to create a happy feeling, a feeling of accomplishment, a feeling of power progression, a feeling of economic growth, right? Depending on whatever kind of game you have or player that you have playing. And then you see a problem in that space, right? So let's say you have your core game loop, you realize the player isn't happy at the end of the core game loop. The player feels like maybe they've lost power instead of progressed in power, or lost economic growth potential instead of gaining based on investing in different, let's say, crafting professions in an MMO. You want to start from there, right? Like you want to start from where the user is having the problem. Like where is the player having the problem in your game? Why are they having the problem? Again, going back into this process, what all is impacting it? How likely are things to change? And then you want to dig into that. So if I said like to answer that, what type of problem solving can and should be considered while designing a game, it should be a user-driven problem-solving method. Like what I explained, you should really focus on what the user is doing rather than just, changes that you can make to your systems.
It's awesome. I think that's all the questions that we have. Thank you,
Yeah,
Shah, for that like fantastic session. I think it was quite deep and informative, much more comprehensive, and quite thought-provoking as well. Like normally you do like different styles of thinking, like mental models of like going about product
hmm
development. Was quite interesting, and I love the discussion around like dashboard visualization and like parsing information, because you don't really have to like fight all of that, right? Trying to parse through information
right.
and like make decision making a lot more easier. So I love the session. Thank you, and I hope like everybody enjoyed it and learned a lot, or as at least taking back things um, back home to think on and try and implement in your day-to-day life. So thank
Yeah,
you.
cool.
Thank you. It's an honor having you
Thanks,
here.
y'all. Thanks for the opportunity. Really
Awesome.
appreciate it. Have a great one.
Have a good day, guys. Thank you. That's it for us. Thank you. Have a good day.
See ya.
Bye bye.